The world is a little bit more complicated and divided between a bit more than just team-based and red-pilled and team leftists. The great advantage of the non-left so far has been that it only had to deal with the cringeworthy Tumblr nonsense, for the most part. And that is very easy to tackle. It gets a lot more complicated though when smart technocrats get into the field, especially the old-school type who tend to be pretty knowledgeable in general, albeit lacking in wisdom more often than not. So one of these smart technocrats, or ordo-liberals as they're called in the corridors of power in Europe, decided to take it to the pages of the publication The Atlantic to criticize and analyze, well, us, more or less. It's a very persuasive argument too, precisely because it comes from a place of knowledge and makes it difficult to argue against. But that's exactly what we'll do. Let's explore. Hello everyone and welcome to the Freedom Alternative. Alright, so the reason I'm making this video is because it's the first article that I read in the last 3 years that is simultaneously smart, critical of the right, and not entirely predictable. Usually, in more than 90% of the cases, when I read such an article, all I need to read are the first 2 paragraphs and I can accurately predict how it will flow and what will the conclusions be, and oftentimes even what examples the author will bring up to sustain his or her thesis. That's why I've come to make episodes of periodic insanity so rare nowadays, because it's too predictable and I get bored. And if I get bored, making a video about something I find boring will necessarily come off as even more boring, which is a no-no for someone who makes long videos. But this one is different. There's still enough stereotypical cathedral media ordo-liberal stupidity in it, of course, but it also raises some valid points and the flow is significantly wiser than what we've come to expect from the opposition. So that's one reason it's worth covering. The other reason is because the author is a particularly not stupid individual. Definitely a slimy, possibly traitorous, tedious, suffering, strongly entrenched establishmentarian, and definitely ideologically possessed, as Jordan Peterson would certainly classify her as, but nonetheless smart, articulate, and definitely more knowledgeable about how the world works than roughly 90%, or maybe I should say 99% of the university professors, 95% of left-wing activists, and roughly 100% of politicians occupying the space between the center and helicopterable. So the author is Anne Elizabeth Applebaum, an old-school historian, policy wonk, and a pundit. Now, she would call herself a journalist, but that's nonsense, and she knows it. But the reason I'm mentioning this is because she's also one of the best propagandists that the modern left has. So while she herself has a rather discreet online presence, her ideas most likely influence your politicians right now if you live in Europe in particular, but also Japan, South Korea, the Anglosphere, Israel, or South Africa. In other words, Applebaum is to be taken seriously before deciding she's full of it. Spoiler alert, she is full of it. But that's not the point. The point is to examine how propaganda is constructed on the opposition side, because Miss Applebaum is, first and foremost, an agent of propaganda, active measures, and disinformation for the old order. She speaks fluent English, Polish and Russian, as well as good enough Spanish. She's married with former top-tier Polish politician Radosław Sikorski. He's a member of all sorts of militant organizations, some of them rather dubious, others a bit more respectable. She also wrote a book about the famine and the Gulag and is a friend of, or to be more precise, she works for Russian dissident Garry Kasparov. The way we know she is an agent of propaganda first and foremost is through the fact that she's in the board of two organizations whose sole purpose is to produce propaganda, namely the National Endowment for Democracy and Renew Democracy Initiative. The former is funded by taxpayers' money, US taxpayers' money to be more precise, and the latter is Kasparov's organization. That's another hint right there. If she had been entirely sincere in her beliefs, she'd refuse to take money from the Trump administration and the Republican Congress. But she doesn't, because her role is not to be an ideologue, but a propagandist. Which is fine, by the way. For the newer observers and the newer subscribers on this channel, we don't see propaganda as inherently bad or as inherently good. Anyway, the third reason why this is interesting enough for me to occupy at least 1 hour talking about this is because of her Russian connections. Unlike the talking heads from MSLSD or the CNN or other cathedral media outlets, she actually knows when things are true or not. She spent years behind the Iron Curtain. Back when she was a legit journalist, she has studied intensively the practice of Marxist-Leninist totalitarianism and understands these nuances quite well. As a consequence, if you notice she's lying, the first assumption should be that she's knowingly lying. And that's useful information because that's how we find out what facts are the Ordo liberals most afraid of. Because elections are coming again, well, there's always elections if you're a global pundit, but you get the point. And one very useful piece of information is to know which facts your opposition is most afraid of. So, now that we know who we're dealing with, let's dive into the article, which is very, very long, so grab some coffee because we'll be spending some time with this. Those of you into this line of work, political operatives, seasoned agitators, students of propaganda, and even part-time agitators, grab a pen and some paper too. You might want to take notes. So, the sad path from Reaganism to national conservatism, titled The Atlantic initially. Then they changed the headline to read, "This is how Reaganism and Thatcherism end." So that's the first propaganda move. The first headline was too honest. It was giving away the bias of the author, which means nobody from the target audience would read. Because make no mistake, this is globalist propaganda aimed at non-leftists, not at establishmentarians and Ordo liberals. As a result, they changed it to a more grave headline, which is also more clickbaity. And so Mrs. Applebaum begins. Quote, "In an Italian hotel ballroom of spectacular opulence on red velvet chairs beneath glittering crystal chandeliers and a stained glass ceiling, the conservative movement that once inspired people across Europe, built bridges across the Iron Curtain and helped win the Cold War, came finally to an end." Close quote. And this is where we see a sample of her literary talent. This paragraph is pure fiction. Not only it is not connected to what she is about to say, but its sole purpose is to convince the reader that she's not coming from a militant left-wing perspective. And that may be indeed true for her personally, but it's not true for her profession. And this will be made abundantly clear in the rest of the article. The paragraph is also pure fiction because it's ahistorical. The conservative movement absolutely did not inspire people across Europe in the 1980s. That's just simply not true. It did inspire people in Eastern Europe, yes, of course. It did inspire some people in the United Kingdom, enough of them to vote for Thatcher anyway, and it absolutely did inspire people across the United States, judging by the results of the 1984 elections in particular. but it did not inspire people across Europe. Germany and France, just like now by the way, were firmly against. Just like today, in the 1980s, the Bond Republic, led by so-called conservatives, was turning a blind eye to the militant communists in West Germany and only started to take them slightly seriously once they went full terrorist. I mean, President Reagan's famous speech in front of the Berlin Wall, you know, the one where he says, "Mr. Gorbachev, take down this wall," that one. Well, that particular speech was preceded by multiple acts of violence by Rote Armee Fraktion. West Berlin routinely had more communist propaganda in the public space than East Berlin, which is still true today, by the way. Meanwhile, in France, the François Mitterrand cabinet was full of KGB operatives, and Mitterrand himself was a socialist who was discussing with Gorbachev how to create the European Socialist Union. Again, this is not a secret. It's been more than 15 years since Russian dissident Pavel Stroilov leaked basically all of this from inside the Gorbachev Foundation. And Mrs. Applebaum is definitely aware of this, because back in 2004 she was very active in following everything coming out of Russia with a focus on what the dissidents were putting out. So yeah, basically the article starts with, or opens with, outright fiction. Let's carry on, it gets funnier. Quote, "The occasion was a conference in Rome last week called God, Honor, Country, President Ronald Reagan, Pope John Paul II, and the Freedom of Nations. Inspired by the Israeli writer Yoram Hazon, convened under the banner of National Conservatism. This event was co-organized by Chris DeMuth, a former president of the American Enterprise Institute in the era when it supported global capitalism and the Iraq War, and Joan O'Sullivan, a former speechwriter for British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. O'Sullivan now runs the Danube Institute, which is funded via a foundation by the Hungarian government. The conference itself was funded, according to DeMuth, by an anonymous American donor. This was the successor to the National Conservatism Conference held in Washington, D.C. last year. That occasion featured a strange agglomeration of new and old conservatives, including both John Bolton and Tucker Carlson, people who still talk hopefully about shrinking the state, and those who want to enlarge it, people still jockeying to be relevant, and people full of confidence that they now are," close quote. And this is the second hint that Mrs. Applebaum is a highly astute observer of propaganda. Again, this is not me holding this against her. Propagandists like her exist by the dozens on the left. My quip is that we don't have anywhere near enough of those on the right to counteract her. But I'm pointing this out because this is something that the non-left doesn't do enough, namely to infiltrate and go to obscure conferences of the opposition. I mean, for short-term perspectives, the Rome conference is entirely irrelevant. No party activist and certainly no voter cared about it. And why would they? But as someone who understands propaganda, Mrs. Applebaum correctly identified the Rome conference as relevant for the medium-term propaganda disputes that are to come. That's why I attend or watch on YouTube all sorts of obscure events that the mainstream either never learns about or they just laugh them off. But as a fellow connoisseur of propaganda, I know that in the medium term, you fish on the fringes to see what you should expect. And Mrs. Applebaum did exactly the same. And this is where it gets interesting, because she felt the need, or her bosses felt the need, whichever it may be the case, to present this as a sympathetic analysis. And we should take note of this, because this is the kind of rhetoric we will hear for sure in case Trump wins this year, or in case our side of the argument scores a few more victories. The discourse will be very subversive. Kind of like this, quote, "The conference in Rome was different in many ways, beginning with the aesthetics. No room in Washington contains quite so many Corinthian columns. The purpose, at least at first, seemed a little more mysterious too. If Reagan and John Paul II were linked by anything, it was a grand, ambitious and generous idea of Western political civilization, one in which a democratic Europe would be integrated by multiple economic, political and cultural links and held together beneath an umbrella of American hegemony. John Paul II wanted Poland to join the European Union. In his famous speech in Normandy, Reagan declared that not just one's country is worth dying for, but that democracy is worth dying for because it's the most deeply honorable form of government ever devised by man. At least when she was still Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher was also a proponent of this vision of the West. She was one of the driving forces behind the European single market, the continent-wide free trade zone that also required a unified regulatory system, the same unified regulatory system that the British have now rejected, and had great faith in the importance of human rights. She said so explicitly, quote, "The state is not, after all, merely a tribe, it is a legal entity," Thatcher declared in Zagreb, Croatia in 1998, according to her biographer Charles Moore, quote, "Concern for human rights thus complements the sense of nationhood so as to ensure a nation-state that is both strong and democratic," close quote. Now, quite frankly, this is what I call top-tier propaganda. It doesn't read like propaganda, it doesn't feel like lying. In fact, many of the new right types of peeps might even be tempted to agree. However, just because it's propaganda doesn't mean it's false, and in this case the reverse is the case. Just because it's top-tier propaganda, it doesn't mean it's true. For starters, by the way, Pope John Paul II absolutely did not endorse Poland's bid to join the European Union. The EU Observer, a staunchly pro-EU publication, explained back in 2002 that it was fake news, the information that John Paul II endorsed the European Union. So Mrs. Applebaum is outright lying here. It just simply did not happen. There's not a single piece of evidence anywhere that the Pope ever endorsed this. And the words of the Pope are kept very tightly, and there's not much wiggle room. However, lying about the Pope is common, so there's that. Secondly, the 1984 Normandy speech by Reagan evoked in the article was also not an endorsement of the European Union. For starters, the European Union did not exist in 1984. Now, I understand that EU propagandists like to claim credit for things that came before them, but it's a bit more complicated. And again, Mrs. Applebaum absolutely does know all of these things. She just chooses to conveniently ignore them. In 1984, the Iron Curtain was still a thing, and the European Economic Community was very, very far away from the gigantic, heavily Marxist-inspired, oppressive bureaucracy that it is today. The European Union, by the way, is not even 30 years old. The European Union as we know it today only exists since 1993 with the Maastricht Treaty. In 1984, the regional organization of some of the West European countries was called the European Economic Community and had more palatable ambitions. In my opinion, even that was a terrible idea, but we can see how even some conservatives would have supported that model. The EEC didn't want to be an empire, didn't want to open the borders, no, not even between the member states, didn't want to intentionally make your energy more expensive, quite the opposite in fact. It didn't want to make child murder a human right, it did not seek to tell its member states how to run their judiciary, and on like that it goes. Virtually none of the evils of modern-day EU existed in the EEC of the 1984. In other words, it was indeed an economic organization based on the original idea that borders are to protect from warfare and illegal immigration, but commerce should be free, or at the very least freer than it was at the end of World War II. That's a moderate enough idea that even Reagan could support. And why wouldn't he? But to take that opinion and superimpose it 36 years later and say that Reagan was essentially supporting EU imperialism, Guy Verhofstadt, and the rest of the extremist insanity coming out of Brussels today is, to put it mildly, disingenuous. So, one outright lie and one disingenuous claim. Well, actually two disingenuous claims, because her Thatcher quote is also ahistorical. She says that Mrs. Thatcher was one of the driving forces behind the European single market, the continent-wide free trade zone that also required unified regulatory system, the same unified regulatory system that the British have now rejected. Well, no, that's not exactly accurate. And Mrs. Applebaum, again, knows this all too well. Thatcher's most famous speech, the one called No, 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 was exactly Mrs. Thatcher as Prime Minister articulating the first case for Brexit. She did support free trade, yes, but was not particularly keen on unified regulatory system and was entirely against the euro currency and the increased powers for the Commission, which they eventually got via the Maastricht Treaty and then further reinforced via the Lisbon Treaty. So that's basically a lie. The British have now rejected exactly what Mrs. Thatcher had rejected multiple times during her tenure as Prime Minister. In fact, word goes around that the Tories sabotaged Mrs. Thatcher precisely because she was, well, a national conservative. She believed in a more open Europe, yes, but open to itself and not the whole planet, and also she believed that Britain must stay Britain and not a marginal county at the edge of the EU empire. As for the 1998 statement from Thatcher in Zagreb, I was unable to find it in order to get the context of it, but who cares? In 1998, Thatcher was no longer Prime Minister and her party had been roundly rejected at the polls and never really recovered until, well, now with Boris Johnson, who, surprise, is a national conservative. Well, sort of, ish. It's complicated, I know. The point is that Mrs. Applebaum uses her enormous talent for writing in order to deliver outright lies wrapped in top-tier propaganda framing. And it will work, because Mrs. Applebaum knows, just as we know, that people are not stupid, people are fucking stupid. So they will believe this crap. I mean, why shouldn't they? Most people have no idea what Thatcher stood for, so, you know, there's that. Anyway, let's read some more. There's a lot in this article, but better dissect it now and have the tools than be caught unprepared later on when this crap will become the main line of attack by subversives. Quote, "The new national conservatism, at least as articulated in Rome, is very different from Reaganism and Thatcherism. The starting point is that European integration and American hegemony are both evil and that universal ideals like human rights are a dangerous ideology. These, in fact, are arguments made in Hazon's book, The Virtue of Nationalism, a work that synthesizes biblical history, the writings of John Locke, and contemporary politics into a caricature of a political philosophy for our times. Hazon has invented a new definition of the nation, tribes that have agreed to live together, more or less, that applies to no existing modern state, not even Israel. He also attributes all of the good things about modern civilization to the nation and all of the bad things to what he calls imperialism. He puts countries and institutions he likes into the first box and those that he doesn't like into the second. Thus it emerges that the Nazis, who specifically called themselves nationalists, were not nationalists but imperialists, as is the European Union, an organization created to prevent the resurgence of Nazism. Britain, Spain and France, despite their long history as empires on land and sea, count as nations," close quote. Okay, so this one is even better. For starters, she attributes the opinions of Hazon to everyone in the chamber. Is that true? Of course not. I mean, she was in the chamber, and she clearly disagrees, so why does she assume that she was the only one who disagrees with Hazon? Heck, does she agree with everything the organizers of left-wing conferences say when she attends? Of course not. That would be stupid and an absolutely absurd standard anyway. But then she goes on to outright lie by claiming that the starting point of the conference is that European integration and American hegemony is evil. Really? I mean, there were attendees there from Prawo i Sprawiedliwość, which is a staunchly pro-USA political party, which she dislikes because her husband is in the opposition, basically. Then there were attendees from Lega, whose opinion about European integration is a lot more nuanced than integration man bad. As for human rights being a dangerous ideology, well, yeah. I mean, for an experienced propagandist, it's quite surprising how little analysis she offers on this point. For instance, why has the right ended up in this position? Surely it's not because Israeli philosopher Yoram Hazon said so. I mean, Yoram Hazon's book came out in 2018. I was talking about human rights as a dangerous ideology on this channel in 2015. And I was writing about it in 2007, and surely I'm not the one who claimed this first. The fact of the matter is that the right-wing's perception about the label human rights changed with the meaning of the label. In 1984, or even in 1998, when Thatcher evoked human rights in Zagreb, the term meant that the state was not randomly arresting people, the politicians are abiding by the results of a vote, censorship is being kept to a minimum, property rights are being observed, things like these. That's what most people understood by human rights. Look at any conservative politician from 1970 and until about 2000 when they used the term human rights and see what they meant by it. However, in 2020, that's not what human rights means anymore. Today, human rights is the right to kill your unborn baby, the right to mutilate and castrate children, the right to have your 7-year-old child forced into masturbation classes developed and taught by pedophiles, the right to use state violence to shut down someone else because they disagree with you, the right to be employed in an organization even though you're incompetent solely because of your sex or ethnicity, and on like that it goes. That's what human rights means today. So is it really a surprise that slowly but surely the right wises up to this and distances itself from the term? Is it really such a surprise? For all intents and purposes, human rights today is, objectively speaking, an ideology. Now, if you're a leftist, you can believe it's a good ideology, while normal people will reserve the right to believe it's a very dangerous ideology, in addition to being crazy. But it is nonetheless an ideology at this point, and most definitely not a universal ideal. All right. Let's go further. Told you this will be long. Quote, "In this worldview, democracy is of no significance. International treaties and obligations do not matter either, not even if people want them. Although membership in the European Union is voluntary, Brexit has just proved that, and is supported by majorities in most countries, Hazon writes and speaks as if the EU were an occupying power." Close quote. Really? So is she talking here about the left or about Yoram Hazon? Because it's unclear. Over the last 5 years, we've seen one side, and one side only, publicly rejecting democracy and international treaties, and that side is the left, alongside with her ordo-liberals fellow travelers. Although this is a more sophisticated version of the argument, it is still the standard left-wing practice, namely projection. Accuse the others of something you yourself are entirely guilty of. I mean, who protested the Brexit vote? Who protested Trump's election? Who will protest Trump's re-election? Who protested Prawo i Sprawiedliwości's election and re-election? She lives in Warsaw sometimes, so she should know the answer to that. Spoiler alert, it's not Yoram Hazon or the National Conservatives, because the National Conservatives were busy, winning elections and shit. Also, the EU should be treated at this point as an occupying power. Because it increasingly is. I mean, listen to Guy Verhofstadt a little bit and you get the idea why more and more people feel that way. Sure, it's not technically an occupying power yet, but then again, it's also not technically true that the EU is supported by majorities in most countries. The Eurobarometer itself admitted that its sampling is so terrible that basically all of their results in the last 5 years are complete and utter rubbish. There will be links in the low bar for all the claims I'm making here, so you can read and consult them. I won't quote things in the video because then the video will get 4 hours long. Anyway, translation. Nobody knows how popular the European Union is in most of the 27 countries still unfortunate enough to be part of this insanity. Also, the voluntary aspect of EU membership is debatable at the very least. There were countries that joined the EU without a referendum following a rigged election where only pro-EU parties were allowed to run. And then there's the case of Croatia, where the no side was outright banned from campaigning, while the yes side got tens of millions of euros in funding, effectively outspending all of the lobby groups combined. In other words, the Croatians were prevented from hearing the argument for no. And even so, the referendum barely passed. So imagine what would have happened if the EU had to stand at the ballot box fairly, like they had to do in Britain. Then the article finally gets to the core of her argument, namely that she's afraid that this side could win. Of course, she doesn't say it that way, but that's the gist of it. Let's read and then I'll explain. Quote, "Just because his thesis is ahistorical and internally contradictory does not mean that it cannot be influential. Many bad books have had great influence. This one has been very lucky, having appeared just as the word nationalism was adopted by Donald Trump, who finds it a useful way of addressing up a set of foreign and domestic policies that are largely governed by his whims and dictated by his self-interest. Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, has used the language of nationalism as well. Hazon's book also appeared at the moment when a handful of Anglo-American conservative intellectuals, jolted out of their old alliances by Trump and Brexit, were looking for a new project, and just when the parties of the European far right were craving the legitimacy that can be granted by British, American, and especially Israeli friends. To put it differently, the arc of history once described by Martin Luther King and Barack Obama is now bending the other way around, and a lot of people are leaping forward." Close quote. That's interesting. I mean, one tactic available in the propaganda arsenal is to call your opponent's success a fluke, or an accident, or just sheer luck. That's what she does here. You see, Yoram Hazon's ideas don't have merits on their own. They just happen to be read and observed because Trump used the word nationalism on TV around the launch of the book. I mean, come on, that kind of arguing is silly at her level. And precisely because she comes up with this silly nonsense is why I believe she is legitimately afraid. It's a coping mechanism, basically. And then there's this business of craving legitimacy, a passage in which I detect some very strong alt-right vibes, essentially. I mean, she says, and I quote again, "Parties of the European far right who are craving the legitimacy that can be granted by British, American, and especially Israeli friends," unquote. Oh, really? That's something I would expect to read on Daily Stormer, or more often on Katehon, which is Alexander Dugin's website/think tank. Those are the places who tend to believe such crap. It goes to show that once you go deep enough into totalitarian thinking, like Mrs. Applebaum does in this article, a little bit of Jewish conspiracy theories just comes with the territory. And she should know better. Well, in fact, she does know better. That's the point. That's why I'm making this video. She knows what she's doing, because the article is written with the purpose of demoralizing conservatives first and foremost. If she can get 10 militant agitators to slow down, her mission is complete. Success. I'm serious. That's how any propagandist thinks. Every time I personally put out some agitprop, I'm looking at it through this perspective. What can I win? And the win is either persuading someone to my side of the argument or demoralizing someone from the opposition. Because elections are not just about how many votes you can get, but also how many votes of the opposition you can convince to stay home. Every vote not cast for the opposition is just as good as a vote cast for you. Mrs. Applebaum knows this all too well, which is precisely why she's using this kind of language. Also, notice that Donald Trump is described as having adopted nationalism, even though his speech on economic matters hasn't changed in 30 years, because he finds nationalism as a, quote, or what does she say? Quote, a useful way of dressing up a set of foreign and domestic policies that are largely governed by his whims and dictated by his self-interest, unquote. At the same time, presumably, Barack Obama hasn't adopted the view that the marriage is between a man and a woman as a useful way of dressing up a set of domestic policies largely dictated by his self-interest in order to be elected, right? Of course not. I mean, it's really amazing how really smart people can end up writing such ludicrous nonsense when they're afraid. Anyway, let's read further. The sight of an intellectual elite undergoing a radical shift in its views and alliances is never elegant, and this event had some rough edges. Hazon's opening speech set a strange tone. He once again set up black and white categories, contrasting bad Enlightenment rational liberals who have no ties to family or place with good conservatives who do, thus leaving out a very large and much more nuanced third category, the many Enlightenment rational liberals who are patriotic, take care of their children, and feel attached to their local customs. He attacked the euro, Europe's common currency, not for its economic faults, but because euro notes are decorated with drawings of imaginary bridges instead of drawings of real ones. He declared that European children are not taught that there is such thing as a nation. Of course, he has every right to evoke an old and legitimate political tradition. Burkean conservatism has been with us for a long time, but some of this was silly. At different times, my children went to Polish, British, and American schools, and they learned about the nation in all of them. It's also ridiculous to claim that liberal Europeans never speak of their nations with pride. Well, actually, that's true. On the very day Hazon was lecturing in the hotel ballroom in Rome, the President of France was lecturing at a university in Krakow, declaring that he feels proud to be French and proud to be European, and saying he expects that Poles feel the same way too. To millions of people, these things do not feel contradictory, close quote. Oh, isn't that cute? Yes. The sight of an intellectual elite undergoing a radical shift in its views and alliances is never elegant. Mrs. Applebaum should know this all too well. In 1990, she was playing in the same team with National Conservatives. Now she plays in Gorbachev's team. So she should know quite a lot about lack of intellectual elegance. As for Macron's perorations in Krakow, please give me a freaking break, mate, really? I mean, elections are coming, and Macron has noticed that his popularity is very low with essentially everyone, except with people like Mrs. Applebaum, Ordo liberals, who in France are a minuscule minority, unlike Germany, for instance. Other than that, Macron polls abysmally low with socialists and with most progressives, not to mention with conservatives, Republicans, and normal people in general. Basically, there's no way Macron wins re-election at this point. But, unlike François Hollande, his predecessor, Mr. Macron is trying to take steps now, 2 years before the election, to get some of that support back. That's why he also started making some true comments about a certain religion of peace. He also started limiting some immigration, now this stunt in Krakow, and so on and so forth. He may not like it, but he has to do it. Why? Precisely because of the National Conservatives. Well, in his case, because of the Russian-funded Rassemblement National. But then again, Rassemblement National would be nowhere near as popular as it is now if it didn't have a point. There are many Russian-funded political parties in every single country in Europe, but for some reason they only win relevant votes in the countries most heavily raped by ordoliberalism. It could be that ordoliberalism itself is the underlying problem, and the success of Russian infiltration is the symptom of that problem. Yes, of course, the symptom should be treated too, but I submit to you that extirpating the underlying disease would go a long way towards alleviating the symptoms. N'est-ce pas, Monsieur Macron? Also, this particular paragraph also shows what happens to people, even very smart ones like Mrs. Applebaum, when they spend too much time in the bubble. So she criticizes Yoram Hazon because he dared to criticize the euro currency on aesthetics rather than economics. In other words, she's genuinely surprised that some people on the non-left are not always concerned just about economics. Well, hello! Aesthetics has been a concern of conservatives for about 200 years, at the very least. I mean, really? But you see, it's okay when the left abandons or at least eschews portions of its core message in order to get more votes. But heaven forbid a Burkean conservative like Yoram Hazon dare use a non-economic argument. Give me a break. And yes, the euro notes are ugly, that's true. And the paper they're printed on is absolute trash, very non-resilient compared to the old paper British pound or the current US dollar, or heck, even compared to the Polish zloty or the Hungarian forint, though the new 500 forint notes are also absolute trash. But that's a separate story for another day. Alright, let's read further. This gets funnier. Quote, "But other speakers in Rome also reflected an almost paranoid sense of persecution. The idea that the nation has been outlawed is clearly something that a certain breed of conservative now genuinely perceives to be true. The American Christian writer Rod Dreher solemnly described the world in which he felt repressed, just as people had been under totalitarian communism. The all-consuming ideology among us is a globalist, victim-focused identity politics, often called social justice," he warned, calling on audience members to think of themselves as Christians persecuted for their faith in the past. Roberto De Mattei, an Italian Catholic intellectual, spoke darkly of a dictatorship of relativism and declared that the progressive establishment had banned the writing of books about the history of communism. "Since I have personally written 3 books about the history of communism, all of which have been published in multiple European languages, including Italian, I found this statement mystifying." Close quote. Now, in this paragraph, I don't know whether she seriously means it when she says she found this statement mystifying or is trying to score a point, because it could be both. It's the least transparent part of the article. If she tries to score a point, she basically does what all ordo-liberals and leftists do: point a particular exception and make that the rule. Yes, she wrote a few books about the history of communism, and some of them quite good actually. But by the time progressive militantism had become a thing, she was also an established figure, very difficult to ban. This is true in any totalitarian society. Some authors are just too big to remove. That's why, for instance, Ismail Kadare was able to write about the evils of communism while living in Enver Hoxha's Albania. He was just too big to be removed. But that doesn't mean that new authors are permitted. If a young man wrote in Albania during Hoxha's time what Kadare was writing, that young man would have been summarily executed by the end of the week. For now, summary executions haven't made a comeback, not in Europe, not yet, but thanks to relativism, which is the de facto ideology of most globalists, Christians in other parts of the world are indeed being summarily executed for speaking. In fact, Christianity is by far the most persecuted religion, and most of that persecution is done through the tacit approval of progressive Western leaders like Barack Obama, Emmanuel Macron, and especially the ordo-liberal icon Angela Merkel. Roberto De Mattei is an Italian Catholic intellectual, emphasis on Catholic. As a result, he speaks from a universalistic perspective, because the Catholic Church is one, not split into national churches. And from that perspective, he's absolutely correct. People of faith, not just Catholics, are harshly persecuted in China for writing books about the history of communism. Meanwhile, the progressive Western intelligentsia is writing odes to Xi Jinping. So yeah, Mrs. Applebaum is unlikely to be banned for her books on communism, but if she wants to get a glimpse about what Roberto Di Mattei was talking about, she should try questioning the transgenderist ideology on Twitter. If she really found the statement by Di Mattei mystifying, here's a way to test what Di Mattei was saying. As for the American Christian writer Rod Dreher, sure, she may perceive his assertions as exaggerated, but there absolutely are pockets in the Western world that are indeed indistinguishable from an intellectual repression perspective from totalitarian communism. The university campuses are one such example. A British campus recently announced with great pride that they will recruit and pay their own Stasi to spy on fellow students and report them for wrong speak and wrong think. Or she could ask Nobel scientist Tim Hunt. Remember that chap? His decades-old career as a top-tier scientist was ended within 24 hours by left-wing Twitter mobs and spineless ordo liberals like you, Mrs. Applebaum. His crime? He made a joke about women that was, likely intentionally so, misquoted and misrepresented. Most recently, the NHS in Britain announced that they will deny treatment to taxpayers who have politically incorrect opinions and dare to express them. So yeah, while the whole society doesn't yet resemble totalitarian communism, pockets of that do exist today and they're very real. Sure, Mrs. Applebaum is wealthy enough and can afford not to give a damn. I get that. But if she's not lying when she says she finds this mystifying, then she should get the hell out of her bubble more often. Because it's unacceptable at her intellectual level and profession not to know and understand these things, at least superficially. I'm just saying. Okay, let's go further. Now she goes into making the classical bait-and-switch argument that the left always does when they lose elections. Quote, "What makes this view odder is that it also clashes with political reality. National conservatives cannot simultaneously be helpless victims of a totalitarian culture and also hold enormous political power, which some of them plainly do. Not all of these powerful new nationalists made the conference. Trump, obviously, was otherwise occupied. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was not there either. Matteo Salvini, the nationalist far-right leader who is Italy's former deputy prime minister and maybe the next prime minister, was supposed to be there but dropped out at the last minute, possibly because he thinks that more votes can be had by associating with Enlightenment rational liberals. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson's government is, at least for the moment, also tacking to the center. The only elected British politician I spotted at the Rome conference was an eccentric Tory MP named Daniel Kaczynski, who is best known as a vocal supporter of the Russian President Vladimir Putin. Close quote. Okay. This particular paragraph is pure propaganda speak. I recognize it from miles away, that's why I burst into laughter. Obviously, she knows a lot better than this, because otherwise she wouldn't have phrased it like this. But anyway, for our people, the response is simple. Politics is downstream from culture. Having the temporary office of president or prime minister is interesting and useful, for sure, but holding the cultural hegemony, now that is what's desirable. And Mrs. Applebaum knows this very, very well. She even wrote a book about that, called Iron Curtain, The Crushing of Eastern Europe 1944-1956, published in 2012, in which she documented, in part, the cultural revolution imposed by the commies. Whether she realizes that or not, her problem is that she doesn't acknowledge her own bias. She's perfectly comfortable with the far left owning the culture and ordo liberals the political power. While she's a bit annoyed by the far left's cultural excesses, and she mentions some of those at the end of the article, at the end of the day she prefers a leftist culture in the Gramsci and Marcusian sense. She doesn't like the Stalinist version or the Leninist version, but the Gramscian and Marcusian versions are okay with her, fundamentally. As a result, anyone attempting to change that, whether it's Stalinists or national conservatives, she finds that threatening. Now that's a legitimate position to hold, albeit one that I would thoroughly disagree with, but I'm not convinced she ever thought about it. Or if she did, then she's basically being intentionally disingenuous in this article. If she didn't, then she's once again a victim of her own shallowness and staying too much inside the bubble. Either way, the problem remains, namely the unacknowledged bias for ordoliberalism, which she calls Enlightenment rational liberals, which is a fancy name for a self-contradictory, anti-national and fundamentally unpopular position. Because if it were popular, it would win elections. So the response to all of this is simple. Yes, of course we want to win elections, but the main goal is to take away the power of the left on the culture, even if that means losing elections here and there. Cultural power is a lot more important than political power most of the time. As for her assertions that Boris Johnson is attacking the center, that's laughable. If that were true, then Boris Johnson would have lost some votes to the Lib Dems. But that didn't happen, did it? Also, is abolishing the BBC a centrist position now? Because I would love for that to be true, but come on, let's be real, it isn't. In my ideal world, the left would believe in 10% taxes and the far right would believe in anarcho-capitalism. In that world, even I would be a centrist. Anyway, let's read further. So, this time she goes back to calling any victory a fluke or a surprise, as well as some low-key lying about some of them. Quote, "Nevertheless, given that neither O'Sullivan nor Demuth is any longer at the center of British or American political debate, O'Sullivan now lives in Budapest and runs an institute funded by the Hungarian government, and given that Hazon is a marginal figure in Israel, the number of European politicians with very real political ambitions and genuine influence who did appear is striking. The divisive and eloquent Thierry Baudet, the Dutch nationalist far-right leader, his party commands about 15% of the vote in the Netherlands. That's a lot in that country's fragmented system. He was on the panel. A politician from Vox, the rapidly growing Spanish party that has broken the post-Franco taboo on nationalist politics, was present too. Marion Marchal, the French politician who has dropped the surname Le Pen but still belongs to the family that funded the French party, now known as National Rally, she also spoke at length." Close quote. Well, I'm sorry, but if Hazon is such a marginal figure in Israel, then why do you write a column in The Atlantic about him and his ideas? Serious question. It's because he's not marginal, that's why. Hazon developed the curriculum for Israel's first liberal arts college in 2013. 2013, not 1950, okay? So first liberal college, 7 years ago. Translation: Hazon's effect on the next crop of liberal arts intellectuals in Israel will be maximal. His ideas are, as we speak, studied carefully by the next intellectual elite. I wouldn't count that as marginal. Quite the opposite, I would count that as a huge win. You'd wish Mrs. Applebaum to be as marginal in Poland or the United States or Britain as Mr. Hazon is in Israel. Or let me put it this way, if Hazon is so marginal, then Mrs. Applebaum is lower than Mrs. Nobody. Of course, that's not true. Both Mrs. Applebaum and Hazon are highly influential, but Mrs. Applebaum has heavily totalitarian instincts, and as a result, she can't possibly recognize talent from an opponent and feels the need to lie. As for the listings of top-tier politicians that did attend the conference, she's not really surprised. She's scared. Because she knows, just like we know, that politics is downstream from culture, and that applies for short term too, not just long terms. Translation: if the right manages to create a transnational networking culture that is even half as big as the leftist one, it's game over for the left and ordo liberals for at least one generation. It really is that simple. And she knows that all too well, especially if you follow her Twitter feed her Twitter feed in general. Just scroll a little bit. I mean, there she isn't always using propaganda language, which is a mistake, by the way, but then again, I won't interrupt her. Anyway, she disguises that fear quite well most of the time. But where it gets interesting is when she tries to empathize and show understanding. It's hilarious. But some more lies first. Quote: Marshall, who is sometimes described as a candidate for the French presidency in 2022, made a well-crafted speech that, like Hazon's, drew a sharp polarizing contrast between conservatives and Enlightenment rational liberals, whom she called progressives. The term seemed to include everybody from President Emmanuel Macron to French Stalinists. Her words were evocative. We are trying to connect the past to the future, the nation to the world, the family to the society. We represent realism, they are ideology. We believe in memory, they are amnesia. But her remarks don't reflect reality. Macron spoke explicitly and at length about history and memory in Krakow and has done so on many other occasions too. To Marshall's fans, that may not matter. Perhaps they feel themselves to be a persecuted minority, and she echoes that view. Perhaps they just prefer to hear about history from someone like her, the spokesman for an ethnic definition of French and Frenchness, instead of Macron, close quote. First of all, notice that she refrained from calling her a racist. That's because Mrs. Applebaum is, as I kept on saying in this video, a much smarter propagandist than the usual staff writers at The Atlantic or most of the other leftist rags. Secondly, Macron's words indeed don't matter. Voters judge by actions, and the actions are slim on Macron's side, let's be fair. There is a reason France is still, to this day, in a state of undeclared civil war, and it's kind of staying that way for a lot longer. This is all Macron's doing. He may speak about history and memory all he wants, but his rule is clearly a revolutionary one, a rule that doesn't care about history and memory at all. And what I just said is not a right-wing talking point. It's something with which the vast majority of the French voters agree with right now. Don't believe me? Follow the news in France for 3 weeks. Then come back and tell me who exactly legit likes Macron other than the tiny cosmopolitan ordo-liberal bunch. Everyone, from the far left to the far right and almost everything in between, despises Macron's rule. And Macron knows that. As I said, that's why he's trying really, really hard to appear less extreme lately. Because he knows too well that Marion Marshall might indeed end up beating him in an election if the elections were to be held today. Why? Because Marion Marshall is more charismatic. It's not just her ideas necessarily, though that helps too, of course. A significant chunk of voters vote on personality and gut feeling, especially when they vote positively. So, they already have the incentive to vote against Macron, and then there's also the gut feeling and the personality. And Marion Marshall quite simply feels better for enough voters. Also, Marion Marshall stands a good chance of taking some of the youth vote, which traditionally the progressives assume to be theirs. Basically, Marion Marshall has the authority to tell Macron, okay, boomer, and then win. I'm laughing a little bit, but I'm very serious about this. Now, will Marion Marshall legit win? No, I don't think so. In fact, it's unclear whether she even wants to run to begin with. After all, in 2018, she started a much more interesting thing called Institut des Sciences Sociales, Économiques et Politiques, which is basically a subversive institution. Now that is a lot more interesting, in my opinion, than the presidency. If she can manage to grow that particular institution, well, her ideas will be dominant in 10 years. Or maybe even slightly earlier, but more realistically in 15 years. Anyway, that kind of institution building is a story for another time. Let's get back to the article. Now Mrs. Applebaum is in the phase where she tries to understand the National Conservatives and fails miserably. Quote, "Still, if it is true that the New Nationalists caricatured liberals, then it is equally true that liberals often caricature the New Nationalists, and I don't want to do so. Some of what Marshall says to the French and some of what Baudet says to the Dutch is indisputably true. Economies really have become more global, which makes small communities more vulnerable. Older landscapes have been destroyed by modernity. People have drifted away from churches, probably for good. Technology is moving very quickly in ways that frighten people. The argument is over how to address the legitimate fears created by these changes. Among others, the European Union itself has come up with a set of solutions, including the donation of money to culture and architecture and the protection of European agriculture and thus European landscapes against competition. You can argue about whether these things work, but in a world dominated by an erratic America and an authoritarian China, the EU remains the only entity large enough to speak up for Europe on the world stage. The Netherlands alone, or even Britain alone, will not be able to do it." Close quote. Whoa, hold on a second. I thought these were marginal people with marginal ideas. Now you're telling me that they have a point? Seriously? And that's one aspect. Second aspect is, again, the narrowness of her thought, or at least her written thought. Because once again, it is debatable whether these are her ideas or not. After all, her salary depends on her not understanding certain things. That narrowness is manifested through her evoking the European Union and using language such as solutions. As we all know, in the real world, solutions don't exist outside the imagination of far leftists and their fellow travelers. In the real world, only trade-offs exist. And the trade-off offered by the European Union has been deemed unacceptable by enough people. Now, you may disagree, of course, but the idea that the EU offered solutions is outright nonsense. The EU can't even properly manage its own stuff. So it's absurd to believe that the EU can manage the landscapes in a continent as diverse as Europe, or really manage anything, which is precisely why more and more people are legitimately toying with the idea that maybe, just maybe, the European Union should really cease to exist. Because outside the tiny and increasingly irrelevant circles which Mrs. Applebaum frequents, nobody really wants or indeed cares about having something that could or should, quote-unquote, speak for Europe on the world stage. Well, I'm sorry, but Europe did just fine for centuries without having someone to speak for Europe on the world stage. It did so well that it created the most successful civilization in human history, all without the European Commission. Why? Well, because Europe had real diversity, that's why. The current EU is killing that diversity. I mean, I'm a bit frightened when I'll have to take my nieces with me on my travels because I'll have to explain to them about countries. When I started traveling, I could see without explanation that countries are a thing. Today, they all increasingly look the same in Europe. Same laws, same policies, almost all imposed by a European Commission directive. I mean, it's not technology that scares people that much. It's uniformization. I don't want to live under the same laws as France and Germany. If I wanted that, I would have moved there. But because my country joined, without a referendum mind you, this Marxist bloc, I have to fight almost daily just to stop incredibly insane EU policy from being imposed upon me and my fellow countrymen. Well, I don't like fighting that much. I'd rather end the war. And since the EU won't relent, the only way to end the war is to abolish the European Union altogether. Now that would indeed be a leap forward. And no, America is not erratic at all. This is where Mrs. Applebaum is heavily underestimating the popular appeal that Mr. Trump has in Europe. Believe it or not, most voters in Europe understand perfectly well what Mr. Trump is doing. There's nothing radical in Trump's politics. That's how we did politics for thousands of years, by bilateral agreements. This multilateralism crap is invented basically yesterday in civilizational terms. And, quelle surprise, it can't pass the test of time. Well, maybe because it's a terrible idea. Maybe. Or maybe because we're all being manipulated by Yoram Hazon into being afraid. This is more or less her argument. That's her attempt at not caricaturizing nationalists. No, seriously, that's her argument. Here, quote, "But other possibilities exist too. One can use the electorate's fears, for example, fan them, exploit them in order to build a new political movement. And because national conservatism very much wants to be a new political movement, this is a prospect that interests many people." Thanks to some rather less eloquent speeches on Polish patriotism and the glories of sovereignty, the audience in Rome thinned out significantly as the day wore on. But as the final session grew closer, cameramen and journalists began drifting back into the room. When the final speaker entered, he won a standing ovation. This was Viktor Orbán, the Hungarian Prime Minister, the man whose career probably best illustrates the distance that the conservatism of Reagan and Thatcher has traveled since 1989. Orbán, I realized, was the person that many in the room had really come to hear. Famously, Orbán has gone one step further than many other European conservatives. For one, he has not been shy about using conspiratorial, sometimes hysterical nationalist language, echoing old anti-Semitic tropes in order to exploit fear of the outside world. "We are fighting an enemy that is different from us," he said in 2018. "Not open but hiding, not straightforward but crafty, not honest but base, not national but international, does not believe in working but speculates with money, does not have its own homeland but feels it owns the whole world. More important, he has surpassed everyone else in Europe in his willingness to destroy the institutions that create the terrain that make democracy possible." That's a wild claim. Although conference participants in Rome spoke at length about oppressive left-wing ideology at universities, Hungary is the only European country to have shut down an entire university, to have put academic bodies, such as the Hungarian Academy of Sciences, under direct government control, and to have removed funding from university departments that the ruling party dislikes for political reasons. Although many said they feel repressed by left-wing media, Hungary is also the only European country that has used a combination of political and financial pressure to put most of the private and public media under ruling party control, close quote. Wah! Wah! Someone call the ambulance! Smirk. Oh no, what the oppression. I mean, think about it. You can't use state funds to promote castration of children in Hungary. Can you imagine what an oppressive society Hungary is? Come on, really? Also, he didn't close an entire university. Orbán didn't close an entire university. That's an outright lie. He merely asked Soros György to follow the same law that all other foreign universities operating in Hungary were already following. He could have chosen to follow the law or to continue to operate without accreditation. I mean, he chose to shut it down and move it to Vienna. Well, tough luck. His choice. There is no such thing as an unalienable right to get state accreditation with the Ministry of Education. There is the right to free association and to free speech, which were never denied to the Central European University. But if you want your inquiry and association to be accredited by the state, you have to follow the same rules everyone else in the same place is following. This isn't extreme. This is basic common sense. 100% of the countries on earth have such rules and expectations from institutions of higher education. I mean, really, can I open a subsidiary of my Freedom Alternative Network and call it a university in France? Well, most likely I can. But can I get the accreditation of the Ministry of Education for my university without following the laws and regulations on foreign universities of the French state? No, of course not. And I can't do that anywhere. Also, the claim that Hungary is also the only European country that has used a combination of political and financial pressure to put most of the media under ruling party control, that's a lie. I mean, Germany has had this situation for 20 years now. No mainstream outlet in Germany is allowed to deviate from the CDU-SPD duopoly. Germany's press freedom is so abysmal that almost everything interesting to read in the German language is based in Switzerland. But you see, when Germany does this, it's called consolidated democracy. When Hungary does it, it's called destroying democracy. Give me a freaking break. Everyone in Europe is doing this to a certain degree. I mean, come on. Tell me about media independence in Italy, by the way, or Sweden. In fact, Sweden is a better example. In Sweden, the state bribes the media to stay in line, while at the same time overtaxes it to make sure nobody can legitimately survive without the state subsidy. Now, I would describe that as a combination of political and financial pressure to put most of the private and public media under ruling party control. But when Sweden does it, that's okay. When Hungary does it, it's haram. When the Italian judiciary are essentially trying to stop Matteo Salvini's political career through trumped-up and politically motivated charges, that's called a consolidated democracy. When Poland tries to purge the judiciary of communist-era judges and modernize the judiciary to resemble less with a closed society and more with a judiciary where the wider society gets a say, no, that's haram. That's undermining the independence of the justice, man. Well, you will excuse me if I won't take lessons of democracy from the most undemocratic countries of Europe, particularly France, Germany, and Sweden. In Germany, the Chancellor outright tried to cancel the results of elections in Thuringia. In Hungary, the Prime Minister accepted that his faction lost in Budapest. So, just on recent events alone, the case that Hungary is less democratic than the European Union norm is very thin. Now, that's not to say that everything Orbán Viktor does is good. No, of course not. But it is to say that Mrs. Applebaum and Ordo liberals in general are not in the position to lecture Hungary about absolutely anything. As Jordan Peterson would put it, clean up your room first before lecturing others, okay? I mean, look, your beloved European Union uses taxpayers' money to support some of the most extremist press outlets in almost every country. And when the EU does it, it's called press freedom. No, seriously, that's how they call it. But when Poland does it, oh, you see, that's haram. These double standards are so blatantly obvious that it would be unrealistic not to expect that eventually someone will build political capital on this. But then again, Mrs. Applebaum works for some of the most unrealistic people that have ever held a position of influence, so maybe that's why she's so surprised. Anyway, she goes on, quote, Orbán's destruction of independent press and academia and his slow politicization of the Hungarian courts have served a purpose quite different from lofty ideas about national sovereignty or the beauty of landscapes. These machinations have enabled the Prime Minister's family and his inner circle to camouflage the myriad ways in which they use state power to get rich. They have also helped him fiddle with electoral rules, gerrymander districts, and adjust the constitution in order to make sure he doesn't lose. He usually pushes right up to the edge of authoritarianism without going over it, almost always avoiding violence, for example, not least because Hungary gets a lot of money from the EU, some of which personally benefits his party colleagues. But if eventually the EU disappears, he will no longer need that restraint. His country is the best illustration of what happens when you dismiss universal values, repress journalists and academics who produce facts, undermine courts and the rule of law. When you get rid of all these things, you are just a few short steps away from corruption and tyranny. This is the real face of the new nationalism, however carefully it is hidden behind an intellectual facade or dressed up as a successor of Reagan and John Paul II. You can see why it appeals to men like Netanyahu or Trump, close quote. Now, it was pretty hard, while reading this particular paragraph, to make the difference on whether she talks about Orban Viktor or about the European Union. Also, let's get one thing straight. You can't gerrymander districts in Hungary, because the concept doesn't exist in the Hungarian political system. Unless you want to argue, I guess it's possible, if you want to argue that Orban personally extended or shrank the size of cities to suit his political purposes. And if you're going to argue that, I'm going to need to see some numbers on that, because last time I checked, the Prime Minister didn't exactly get a say in this. As for using state power to get rich, yeah, that's absolutely true. That's a fair allegation. But then again, where were you when Gerhard Schröder was doing the exact same thing? Or Tony Blair? Or François Hollande? Or Barack Obama, for that matter? Or really 100% of the politicians in Europe after 1993? And 1993 is intentionally chosen because it's the year the Maastricht Treaty came into force, effectively facilitating and partially legalizing the generalization of corruption in high office. Name one politician from anywhere you want in Europe in the last 27 years that at the same time served a full term as Prime Minister or President and also is not involved in a corruption scandal. I'll wait. I'm sure there is one, maybe. I'm sure there's that at best the list would fit the fingers on one hand. And I think I'm being too optimistic on that, am I? Anyway, the point that I'm trying to make here is that the corruption of Orban Viktor is not outside of the European norm. Quite the opposite. It's one of the things that makes Orban Viktor a very normal and indeed normative politician in the European Union. His corruption doesn't set him apart in the EU at all. Besides, can we look a bit on the numbers? At the same time as all of this is happening, Danske Bank laundered hundreds of billions of dollars for the Russian mafia. Airbus offered bribes going into billions of dollars in France, the United Kingdom, Austria, and the United States. Deutsche Bank did the same in the Netherlands and likely other countries too, but they didn't get caught yet. The Western European corruption is big league, as Trump would put it. In this comparison, Orban Viktor can't even begin to hope to be at least in the top 100 most corrupt. Now, again, all of these facts do not excuse Orban Viktor's corrupt practices, of course they don't, but these facts must indeed be accounted for when discussing corruption. You can't go Orban man bad because Orban man corruption, while at the same time treating much more dangerous and dozens of orders of magnitude higher Western European corruption as just business as usual. That will not fly anymore. She says that Hungary is, quote, the best illustration of what happens when you dismiss universal values, repress journalists and academics who produce facts, undermine courts and the rule of law. When you get rid of all these things, you are just a few short steps away from corruption and tyranny. Well, I could say the exact same thing about the European Union. The EU dismisses the universal value of borders. It represses journalists and academics who produce facts. Try submitting a report that is honest about Islam and see what happens. Submit that with the European Commission. The European Union also heavily undermines the universal value of the rule of law via judicial activism at the ECJ. And yes, when you get rid of all these things, you are just a few short steps away from corruption and tyranny. The EU is already so heavily corrupt that they don't even conduct regular audits anymore, because that would mean entire commissions would have to go to jail. And it's slowly becoming more tyrannical. This is the fundamental conflict of visions here. What normal people understand through universal values is now radically different from what people like Mrs. Applebaum understand. And of course, Mrs. Applebaum is afraid of that because she knows that if the National Conservatives are playing their cards right, by 2035, her lofty ideas will be a distant memory. Now, would the National Conservative hegemony be better? I don't know. I suspect some things will get worse and others will get better, and some of them will even get significantly better. The question is whether the trade-off is worth it or will be worth it. But to explore that question, it would mean first and foremost to engage honestly with ideas. But since that's not possible yet, the National Conservatives are ipso facto preferable because at the very least they're not insane on all chapters, like the Ordo liberals are. Anyway, let's read further. Man, this is quite long. Well, 2 more paragraphs. Quote, "Nothing about this approach is a secret, though. Orban was not asked about any of it when he appeared on stage. Indeed, Demuth asked him to explain the secrets of his success. With a straight face, Orban said, among other things, that it helps to have the support of the media. In the back of the room where the press were sitting, a few people laughed. At another point, Orban also described his political philosophy as Christian democracy, implying that this is something brand new and radical. In fact, it is very old. German, Dutch, and Belgian Christian Democrats were the founders of the European Union, and Angela Merkel, a Christian Democrat and the daughter of a Protestant minister, runs Germany today. She is Christian, but not in the way Orban or many of the Rome panelists define themselves as Christian. Her Christianity offers a moral guidance, not a way to divide us from them. The latter is an aggressive new political identity that many people in the room seek, especially if it will grant them the right to abolish the rule of law when they gain power." Close quote. Okay, this is pure propaganda, this time of the worst kind. Which strengthens my belief that Mrs. Applebaum is legit scared. There's no way I can translate this because an experienced propagandist knows that you can't just put 100% lies if you want to be effective. So, first of all, allow me to question Mrs. Merkel's Christianity. I mean, she worked for Honecker in a de facto atheist system. I'm sorry if I'm completely unwilling to take moral guidance from a DDR apparatchik, okay? Secondly, the Christian Democrats who wrote the Treaty of Rome in the 1950s were further to the right of AfD today. The Christian Democrats in the 1950s would look at the modern CDU and then call upon the CIA to do pest control on the communist problem. And I'm very serious about this. I mean, sure, Orban Viktor is not exactly a Christian Democrat either, sure. But if this is your preferred criterion, Orban Viktor is closer to what a Christian Democrat should be than Angela Merkel ever was or will ever be. It's really that simple. As for being, quote, an aggressive new political identity that many people in the room seek, especially if it will grant them the right to abolish the rule of law, oh, you mean like Angela Merkel did, right? I mean, what does the German rule of law say about the chancellor dictating the results of the election or ordering a rerun when she doesn't like the result? Again, Orban Viktor, for all of his multiple sins, never did that. Mutti Merkel did. What does the German rule of law say about violent groups burning down houses and cars of non-leftist politicians? What about violence being used to force politicians out of political life, as it happened recently with Ralf Höcke? The rule of law in Germany has any opinion about that? No? Thought so. But when some edgy kids put a mustache on Merkel, that's when the rule of law has an opinion. Then there's calls for investigation. You see, I would take your sorry lot more seriously, and indeed most of those who now vote for National Conservatives would have also taken you more seriously if you hadn't been insane. And by you, I mean both you Ordo liberals and you personally, Mrs. Applebaum. I mean, seriously, look at her Twitter feed. It's completely deranged. Scroll back to 2014 and it was quite sane and pleasant. but something happened with y'all folks. You call it progress, while we call it degeneration. And some of us are nasty enough to outright refuse to progress alongside you. Tough luck. And finally, she concludes with something I hope she will be proven right. Quote, "The world inhabited by Reagan and John Paul II is long past, and no one knows how they would react to so-called cancel culture and Twitter mobs, or the backlash against Western culture or American but not Hungarian college campuses, or some of the uglier strains of far-left thinking. But somehow I doubt their response would be the creation of a new kleptocratic authoritarian right that chips away at the institutions preserving democracy. Nor do I believe they would have wanted to destroy the institutions that have long undergirded the West, as so many of these new nationalists want to do. Like Mrs. Thatcher, I aspire to live in a nation-state that is both strong and democratic. A nation that inspires patriotism and respects the idea of human rights. I don't see why love of a country and love of history would be incompatible with membership in broader Western communities. But in the political world we are now entering, that may soon become so." Close quote. Well, I hope she's right. And in the political world, soon enough, it will be a mainstream position to see an inherent contradiction between patriotism and being part of tyrannical Marxist organizations like the European Union. I've held this view since 2005, when I learned what the European Union actually was, as opposed to what academics and pundits claimed it was. In my opinion, it is profoundly unpatriotic to be pro-EU. You're either a patriot or you're not. You can't be both. As I always say, some aspects of reality are inherently extremist by their nature and don't leave room for a moderate or a centrist position. You know, just like pregnancy. You're either pregnant or you're not. You can't be partially pregnant. Same goes with patriotism. You're either a patriot, which means you accept both the good and the bad of your country and aspire to gradually improve it through the institutions that carried your nation so far, or you're for the European Union, which means you consider your country inherently terrible and incapable and thus undeserving of sovereignty. You can't be both. You can't be a patriot inside the EU. No, that's absurd. Also, I do hope that through increased right-wing transnational networking, the school of thought that we don't need a supranational bureaucracy in Brussels in order to cooperate, that school of thought will also develop further. We will need to rediscover what we all knew as a civilization until roughly yesterday. Yes, it's not going to be easy, and perhaps some of us won't be alive to see the end of it, but it has to be done. If there is to be a Europe in 2100 that resembles to what we think when we say Europe now in 2020, this has to be done. Will it be done? I don't know. I know I'll do my part. And Mrs. Applebaum seems to believe that it will be done even though she's doing her part to prevent it. I guess we'll see, if we live long enough, of course. She's also correct when she says that the world inhabited by Reagan and John Paul II is long past. Yes, and progressives like her are the ones that buried it. Back in Reagan's time, the US would arm militias to physically remove communists. That was a very good thing to do, by the way. Today, you get called far-right for simply donating to a conservative organization. I mean, Steve Bannon is being slandered day in and day out for simply visiting a few cities and meeting with local conservatives to share some knowledge. Yes, the world of Reagan and John Paul II is indeed long past because conservatives have been pussies and allowed the progressives to bury it, in part because conservatives became complacent. Now, leftists are less complacent but fully insane, so it's a good enough opportunity, probably the best we'll get in a generation. Whether it will be seized or not, that's the open question. But then again, I made this video for analysis purposes, not for propaganda purposes. Mrs. Applebaum thinks that for propaganda purposes it is useful to promote the idea that it will happen. Don't get complacent. We've just started our long march through institutions. it's gonna be a bumpy and long ride. Eyes on the prize, peeps. I'm just saying. All right, enough with this. Oh, Jesus Christ. Well, that was long. Well, dissecting propaganda is not a simple task, so there's that. So, what do you all think? Have you identified aspects that I missed? And surely I missed a few, as I made the video with an eye on the clock, so there's that. But yeah, do tell me in the comments, because this is a relevant conversation. You will, for sure, see more of this kind of rhetoric in the years to come. Not this cycle, but if Trump wins and the GOP will be in a very strong position in 2024, this kind of rhetoric will be commonplace. Same in Europe. If Salvini somehow manages to become prime minister, Macron gets crushed in the parliamentary elections, and Poland continues to do very well, this kind of rhetoric will increase. That is, if the leftists won't double down on stupidity, which they might, but we shouldn't bank on that and be prepared in case the NPCs get a superior update. I'm just saying. Also, Rod Dreher, who spoke at the conference and whose words have been intentionally mischaracterized in this piece, he wrote a rebuttal in the American Conservative. I'll leave a link to that too if you're curious. Certainly, the American Conservative magazine offered a much more balanced view of the conference than Mrs. Applebaum did in the pages of The Atlantic. And with all of that being said, thank you all for watching. Thank you for your consistent and generous support. Don't forget to subscribe. Visit our website, freedomalternative.com. Particularly the library section. Mrs. Applebaum wrote about Gulag without being there, so maybe consider giving me a shekel so I can physically go to the Gulag and then tell you stories from the Gulag and show it to you. So yeah. With all of that being said, thank you all for watching, and I will see you all soon on the Freedom Alternative.